is going to be only America first. America first.
We're going to be coming to you twice a month on the podcast.
I look back on where we are today and building AFPI, and I sincerely believe the time in the White House was actually in preparation for what we're building now.
Welcome to the show. All right, well, welcome to the show. This is the America First Agenda. I'm Chad Wolf, the Executive Director of the America First Policy Institute and former Acting Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Here at the America First Agenda, we go behind the scenes with the 45th President's cabinet, staff, policymakers, and other leaders working to build an America where Americans come first. So I'm really excited about today's show. I'm joined by two leading figures of President Trump's National Security Council, as well as on-air commentators these days, to help us sort through the mess that is Joe Biden's foreign policy and what is currently occurring both in Ukraine and around the world. We've got Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, who served as President Trump and Vice President Pence's National Security Advisor, as well as the Chief of Staff of the National Security Council. I should also mention he's got just a fantastic book, War by Other Means, that kind of chronicles his time in the Trump administration and gives you a number of behind-the-scenes look at President Trump and how he made decisions. So highly recommend that. We're also joined by Fred Fleitz, who served 25 years in the intelligence community and again later served as the Chief of Staff for the National Security Council and Deputy Assistant to President Trump. Gentlemen, it's great to have you. I'm glad you're here in the seat because it's timely, right? We've got a situation going on in Ukraine with Russia and around the world. We have Vice President Harris, who's over there today. I think she arrived yesterday. So we're going to jump right into it to try to unpack and make some sense about what's going on here so that the listeners and viewers can have an understanding of kind of your view, your take on it, and kind of how it would probably differ from an America First approach to the issues that we're facing. So straight into the headlines. We've got Ukraine. We've got, you saw over about 200,000 Russian troops congregating along that border, the Russian-Ukraine border. We're now 2 weeks into the invasion. Let me open it up to both of you. I'll start with you, General Kellogg. How did we get here? That's a big question. But in your view, how did we get to the point to where now we're seeing on a daily basis just some very difficult images, video coming out of Ukraine, and Europe kind of still trying to decide what to do? And again, we have the Vice President over there today.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. Thanks for having me. Look, I think how we got here is you have to look at presidential leadership to start with. When you look at the last four presidents, and this means President Biden, President Trump, President Obama, and then before that, President Bush, the fact is this is the first, Trump was the first president where Russia never tried to take territory, sovereign territory from anybody else. And the reason he did that is Putin at least had a healthy respect for President Trump. And he knew that, I'd say that President Trump was either rationally irrational or irrationally rational, one of the two, is that nobody really knew what he was going to do. And I think Putin respected that. And he said, I'm not sure where he's going to go, what he's going to do, so I just will bide my time. And then when President Biden came in, he realized that he had somebody that he could leverage pretty heavy. And the reason I say that is because when he took Crimea in 2014, Joe Biden was the Vice President of the United States. So you kind of said, okay, I could see this guy. And then when Afghanistan occurred, the absolute debacle of the withdrawal that we had, he kind of understood how this guy led and back on historical leadership faults that Biden had. I think Biden gave this opening to Putin, and Putin, who is an autocrat, he's ruthless, frankly, he's a thug, took the advantage of it, and he went forward. And he pressed this effort over the months as he built up strength. And he slowly built up numbers, and he kept saying, what's going to do? He built it to 30,000, then he built it to 40,000, then he built it to 50,000. And as he continued to build numbers up, he saw that the Biden administration did not respond. They didn't respond with sending a lot more weapons in there, either Javelins or Stingers. In fact, the Stingers, the anti-aircraft weapon system, only came into play for the United States in the last couple of weeks. So he looked at this and he said, okay, I see that there's weakness here. And there's a gap here, and he filled the weakness. And the reason why this is important, and it's important for the world to understand, everybody to understand, is this is the first time since 1945 we've had a clash on the continent between the largest country in European Asia area, which is Russia, and the second largest, which is Ukraine. It's the first conventional war since 1945. The problem is one of the protagonists, Russia, has got nuclear weapons, and now you're facing off with potentially NATO countries, which also have nuclear weapons. And the concern is where is this going to extend itself and go to? If this was a prize fight, my attitude would be that Russia is losing this. He's behind on points. That doesn't mean an overwhelming force won't eventually win the day for him. But if you look at it, he's having enormous problems, and the problems of his own making, both in how he's fought militarily, the strategic thought that maybe that they would just roll over. He's now facing an incredibly charismatic leader in Zelensky. He's looking at a populace that is willing to fight. As Zelensky said to him, when the invasion started, when you invade, you will see my face, not my back.
Right.
And he's laid down the marker, and now I think Russia's having an enormous problem trying to win this fight.
So let's hold on to that thought about where does it go over the next several weeks and maybe even months. But I did want to highlight, or maybe foot stomp a little bit and turn it over to you, Fred. When we talk about leadership or the lack of leadership, right? I think President Trump, a lot of folks said during his 4 years, well, he's unpredictable. We don't know what he's going to do. And they said that as if that was a bad thing, as if that was something that should be looked down upon. And I think in hindsight, the general just mentioned it, that may actually be an attribute that we want to see in our leadership and presidents going forward, because it keeps individuals like Vladimir Putin and others on their heels because they don't know exactly how to respond. They don't know if they make certain moves what the United States is going to do, and that may be a positive and not a negative. Your thoughts?
Well, it's a great question for the America First Policy Institute, which believes in what President Trump believed in, that this is an isolationism, but it does mean a strong America and using force prudently. And that's what President Trump believed in. And various rogue states around the world were never sure when President Trump might use military force. And I think that kept the North Koreans and the Iranians on their toes. And you may, I mean, frankly, the Iranians started harassing American ships in the Persian Gulf. Trump threatened to attack them. The harassment stopped. They took him seriously. Yeah. They feared him. To follow up on what General Kellogg said, it's hard to improve given his excellent analysis. We have the weakest president in American history, the worst foreign policy I think our country has ever had. Yeah. We had the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, an unserious foreign policy that is obsessed with climate change, the Biden administration basically appeasing Putin all year long. But in the run-up to this invasion, as tanks were driving on roads about to invade, and that was a bit of a clue because the damage they do.
That's a pretty good clue.
A pretty good clue,
right.
Something's coming.
Right.
Biden officials continue to say, well, if Ukraine wants to join NATO, Putin can't determine that. We have an open door policy. This was time for serious talks to stop sticking in Putin's face that Ukraine can join NATO if it wants to. It certainly seems unfair to say that we're going to let Putin have a veto over this. I don't mean to say that. Something was coming, and this administration was so out of it and so arrogant. They ignored what was coming and just continued to say, well, we're just going to put tough sanctions down. Putin will never invade. Or we'll leak intelligence that there might be a false flag operation. That will stop them. They made the wrong step every step of the way. And after the invasion began, they still didn't seem know what to do. What was the point of sending Kamala Harris to try to negotiate a settlement in Poland? Harris obviously has no foreign policy capabilities. William Burns was ambassador to Russia. He's fluent in Russian. Where is he? Why isn't he the special envoy?
Right. Well, all of those are good points, and I think you both are talking about a term or a phrase, I should say, that's used quite readily, which is peace through strength. And I think that obviously you had that during the Reagan administration. You saw that again during the Trump administration. I think that's what's lacking here. But I would go a step further. I mean, I think we are leading from behind. When you have a president at the beginning of this who, I think he was asked a question of, do we think Russia's going to invade and what are we going to do about it? And he said, well, it's up to them. as if the United States had no position, had no view, could take no action, could do nothing. We're just going to sit back and wait. And then maybe it was yesterday or the day before when he was asked about high gas prices. He said, someone said, well, what can we do about this? He said, well, not much. It's Russia's fault. So it's this sort of abdication of responsibility that as the world's largest superpower, that you're just going to sit back and react to things instead of trying to help shape the environment, which I think is what President Trump and other successful leaders have done.
Yeah, and let me just a little bit of a divert, because Fred said something I think it's very, very important, because you start to see it a little bit in the mainstream media right now, that America first means isolationism. No, it doesn't. We've never said it does. When we were in the White House with the president, we never talked about isolationism. What America first means is that the first priority of any government should be protecting the American citizens. And once we get the American citizens right, once we make sure that they're protected, once make sure all the programs that are in place should be well, take care of our roads or our health, whatever it is, then we can help others. It's not the other way around. Yeah. So when I hear this term isolationism, I said no. I said we were very active militarily when we needed to be. If you don't believe me, pick up your phone and try to call Baghdadi or Soleimani. They're both dead. Yeah. So we killed 2 terrorists. We eliminated the ISIS caliphate. We moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem after we were told by a lot of people that we would start the third intifada. That doesn't happen. And I think that's important for people to understand. And where it means is today is what our reaction would be and what's happening today. I think President Trump or anybody in the America First agenda would be very aggressive pushing forward and against the Russians. Look, we continually pounded NATO, and people said you're anti-NATO. No, we weren't. What we said is everybody needs to pay what they obligated themselves to pay, which was 2% GDP over that 20% modernization, which they said they would agree to in 2014 in the Wales Declaration. I sat next to Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, when she told the Vice President Pence, she would never get there. What did we see Chancellor Olaf Scholz do just last week? They're going beyond 2%. Yeah. I said it tongue in cheek. If you really want to get the Russians scared, rearm Germany. They always seem to march east. I said, that's what you want to do. So I think that's important to understand what America First really means when it came to international activities. And again, as a repeater, it was not isolationism. It was making sure we were straight. And once we're straight, then we can help others.
And a strong America also meant energy independence. And if we're energy independent, we're more secure. The world is more stable. And we were energy independent as President Trump was leaving office. He was irritated that Europe refuses to become energy independent and is hostage to these radical environmentalists who think that we can replace coal and natural gas and gasoline with wind and solar power. Well, that isn't working, and it isn't going to work, but it is just appalling that the response by the German government right now to cutting off Russian oil and gas is that they're going to up their commitment to green energy. Well, I mean, we know that there is a war in this country by the Democrats against fossil fuels and against gasoline-powered engines. That's why we're in the predicament we're in right now. This is not Putin's gasoline price hike. This is Biden's price hike because of his enemy, his war on fossil fuels, and it seems like he's not going to end that war.
Well, we saw that, right? We saw that during candidate Biden's campaign, where he talked about ending subsidies for fossil fuels, cutting back, no more drilling, either onshore or offshore. They've fulfilled all those campaign promises. The problem is it's now put us in a situation where up until recently we were continuing to buy oil from Russia, as well as parts of Europe as well, and continue to not be that energy independent nature that we saw under President Trump. And I think that's why we're seeing, $4 or $5 gas prices today. High inflation. I mean, again, a number of these decisions that were made early on, even before Ukraine, is having very real impacts because they're the wrong policies for America to begin with, and that's only just magnified as we get into this issue. Where do you see both the Russian forces, but also maybe more importantly, what do you see as the U.S. and NATO's reaction to that?
I think we're on 2 paths, and each one is different, and one of them has enormous danger to it. One of them is if Russia and Putin continually struggle, then they have a policy, military policy, that is to escalate to de-escalate. They are also a country that has said they were willing to use, which is abhorrent to Americans, they're willing to use nuclear weapons to de-escalate. They have weapon systems we don't have. It's what they call sub-kiloton nuclear weapons. We used to have something like that in the 60s. It was called the Davy Crockett system. So they're willing to use a small yield nuclear weapon, and they could use it as a demonstration, put it over a field nobody sees or uses, to show their determination. That is a concern. If they continue to struggle, they would go that way, because they are in fact struggling very hard. The second part is most conflicts have a diplomatic off-ramp.
Yeah.
We're not seeing that. And we're not seeing that because the Russians are not talking to the United States of America at all. They're ignoring Joe Biden because Putin does not respect Biden, and there's no love lost between the two. And you're looking at President Xi trying to, in a way, to get involved, and he's talking to Bennett of Israel, or he's talking to President Macron of France, or he's talking to Chancellor Olaf Scholz of Germany, but he's not talking to the United States. We are sidebar.
So that's a great question. Sometimes we hear about these back channel discussions that are occurring, and they're not always in the public, but from your viewpoint and the folks that you talk to, as well as you, Fred, so you don't think that that's occurring at all with the United States, even back channel, out of the press, out of the viewpoint, and trying to find a solution?
No, I don't think there is, and that's what's disappointing to me, because you look at all of the players, and these are repeats of the Obama administration when you look at it for the most part, and Putin has no respect, nor does his Foreign Secretary Lavrov, with any of the players out there. And I think what's happened is, and Fred made a great comment on this, and it's either I'm not sure if it's an insult or just absolutely a fool's errand, but
right.
Why you would send Vice President Harris to Poland to try to do some type of negotiations when she's never even gone to our border to stop the border issue that we've got in the South. And everything she touches turns bad. And so I would say, find somebody, as Fred said, there's other people out there you could do it, but there's no back channel. In the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy had his brother, Bobby Kennedy, and he did the offside negotiations. We're not seeing any of that, and that's my concern, that we are playing a sidebar role, that letting some of the other allies work it. But Putin is hell-bent on taking over all of Ukraine, and I see no diplomatic off-ramp in the future.
Well, Fred, you, in general, you just touched on it. Vice President Harris in Poland, I believe, she's now had discussions, high-level discussions, probably visiting a refugee camp either today or tomorrow. I think we've all sort of scratched our heads and said, everything that she seems to deal with does not go well, right? So whether that's sending her to the border hasn't really gone well, sending her to the Munich Security Conference didn't really go well, and now we're sending her to Poland. I mean, you mentioned Ambassador Burns and others that may be an acceptable solution. Can you dig down and why is that important? When we see Vice President Harris, who has no foreign policy experience, has never really dealt with this, and continues to make a number of missteps. I think it goes back to the leadership question that we were talking about at the beginning, but why is this so important?
Well, let's back up on what we're talking about here. It's a bad idea to back a megalomaniac with a huge nuclear arsenal into a corner. Yeah. All we talk about is let's give weapons to the Ukrainians, let's hurt Putin. There was one congressman who said, I wish I could punch Putin in the nose. Another one was saying we should try to assassinate, or someone should try to assassinate Putin. This is not the right way to talk right now. The solution to this is never going to be acceptable to everyone. Given that Putin has nuclear weapons, he's not going to be put up on war crimes trials. He's not going to go before a court. Some type of mediation has to occur. And General Kellogg is exactly right. There's just no talk about that. Yeah. I don't think the U.S. is going to be able to lead it, but we certainly should be involved. But there's almost no talk about it. Now, there was a meeting today in Turkey between the Ukrainian and Russian foreign ministers, mediated by Turkish President Erdogan. Didn't go anywhere, but I think that was promising. I'm hopeful that these extremely tough international sanctions on Russia, coupled with a much higher than expected losses by the Russian military, will eventually get Russia to deal. But there's a role we can play there, and we have to do something we're not going to want to do. We have to talk to the Ukrainian government and say, you have to deal too. You're going to have to make some compromises. You're going to have to promise neutrality. I know that's really offensive. that the Ukrainian government would offer anything when they had no role in this. They did not cause this. They were completely innocent. But realistically, as a nuclear armed power, we are not going to go to war with Russia. We're not going to send troops in there. And when I hear...
To follow what Fred said, because it's a great observation, for those of us, and all three of us have been inside the White House during the Trump administration, so we saw politics up front pretty clearly in presidential decision making. You know, this is when you have to have really good advisors. I mean, your advisors have to be rock solid, and they have to come in and be very dispassionate. And sort of like Fred was just explaining, there are things that in your gut you just hate to say.
Right.
You know, you're saying you have to accept this to go to an off-ramp. But that's where you get paid the big bucks as an advisor to do it. And we saw that a lot of times in the White House. You do not see that in this administration. I don't think there's anybody there that has got an ounce of sense to go in there and say, this is what we should be doing. I know it's difficult to do it. Yeah. Primarily because there's a chief executive in President Biden that will not accept that advice. And people say, well, what are you talking about? I said, look, I know from pretty good sources, since they were personal friends of mine, Millie and Lloyd Austin, who I've known for years, they both worked for me, what the recommendations were when they went in Afghanistan, and they were ignored. So you've got a chief executive that ignores solid recommendations, as difficult as they are, because you're right, you're not going to get the full loaf. You know, if you want to fight to the death, but I'm trying to get you an off-ramp so we don't get to that stage of potential nuclear use in that part of the world.
Yeah, and off-ramp is so important because not only does Putin have nuclear weapons, he has much stronger conventional weapons, hyperbaric missiles that will set off a giant fireball that'll vaporize people in an entire city block. Other missiles he has not used. This could get so much worse. And I mean, it's offensive to talk about giving Putin an off-ramp. But in this situation, we have to talk about that. And I think it's time to stop leveling threats that we're going to beat Putin up or you know, insinuate that someone should assassinate him, and be realistic that if we don't find a way to do this, we could be looking at hundreds of thousands.
You brought up NATO earlier in the conversation. I think a lot of people sort of scratch their head and say, well, this is a European problem. Why isn't, maybe it's not NATO, but why aren't the European powers doing more to lead on this front? You know, there's always been some talk about a no-fly zone over Ukraine, and because you see these images, right? You see cities being destroyed, you see women and children dying, and people saying we have to do more. From a humanitarian standpoint, we, the West, need to be doing more. Obviously, there's some difficult decisions to be made there, but there may be some ramifications that most folks aren't really realizing when you say, let's put in a humanitarian corridor, and then we've got to enforce that. Walk us through why some of that may be problematic, or in your view is doable.
Yeah, well, when it comes to NATO, NATO's a defensive alliance. And the reason we used to hammer NATO a lot is because they weren't fulfilling their financial obligations
right.
to build up. The other thing with NATO is not only is it a defensive alliance, but to get an agreement, it takes all 30 countries to do it. If you have one outlier that says, no, we're not going to do it, well, then you can't do it. So if somebody says, well, we're going to, let's just use the no-fly zone for NATO to go into Ukraine, which I would not advocate. There's other ways I believe to do it. But if one country said no, then you can't do that. Then you have to go unilaterally on your own if you wanted to do it, or go with some other partners. So it's almost like NATO's kind of hurt itself by becoming such a defensive alliance. Yeah. My frustrations with the Europeans is they have failed again. And people need to sit back and say, well, yeah, you're right. Look, they have been trying to solve the issue with Ukraine in the Minsk Accords, with Minsk I and Minsk II, since 2014. And they haven't been able to get there. So now you're talking, 7, 8 years of negotiations. That's part of it. And look, let me be very clear. Putin's a thug. He's arrogant. What he's doing is beyond the pale. And probably when it comes to war crimes, and Fred's right, they won't bring it up on The Hague, but he's basically doing things that are criminal in nature when it comes to war. But he gave us signals early on that this is what we wanted to do, and the Europeans kind of just dithered away with it. And there's a lot of fault. And so that's my frustration.
So why do you think they did that? Do you think they thought he was bluffing? Do you think they thought, like, I really don't think he's going to do what they've kind of outlined they'll do?
Well, look, when Fred and I were in the White House, we had a really good Russian team. okay? And we had some really good people. Some of them weren't necessarily pro-Trumpers, but they were, I think, the smartest in the business because we brought them in to do that. That's one thing people don't appreciate at the Trump White House. We really did bring in some pretty smart people. And the consensus was, Putin doesn't bluff. When he says he's going to do something, he's calculating, he'll go forward, he won't bluff. But his blind side is he has no appreciation of the West. The furthest west he was ever at was in Dresden as a KGB agent. So he has a blind spot. And his blind spot is him not bluffing, but how's the West going to react? And you're seeing that today play out very well. He didn't bluff, and he's got a blind spot because I think we surprised him, the West did, by coming at him hard. And he also has a blind spot to Ukrainian people fighting back. So it's one of those, it's a dynamic environment. You're dealing with somebody, and you hate to say this, and I'm with Fred, because it tears at your guts when you say this, seeing what we're seeing. But there's got to be a diplomatic off-ramp, or we're heading towards a really bad situation with a nation that's got nuclear weapons and has a policy that they're willing to use them.
Yeah. Right.
And a total destruction of the second largest country in Europe.
And we can't say that we were surprised. We saw what was coming with this buildup on the border.
Well, I think they said they were
and General Kellogg and I, we knew that an invasion was coming.
Yeah.
There was ample time to stop this, to take NATO membership off the table, maybe for 20 years. We'll find a diplomatic solution to this. But as I said, as the tanks started driving to the border on roads, that was a sign that something's coming. And this administration kept thinking that, oh, they'll never do that. We'll threaten them with tough sanctions, and the Russians will never, they'll never defy us. It was unbelievable lack of foresight and imagination. And as I said, we have 3 more years of this administration. I'm very worried what's going to happen.
Thanks for bringing that up, Fred. General, I've heard you say, maybe on 2 different occasions, and now this is a more tactical question when we talk about the the convoy rolling in. You said the Russian military follows IFR. Can you explain what that means a little bit and kind of get us down into the sort of the tactical nature? Because we've seen a lot of video of this huge convoy kind of stalled or perhaps, have stopped on purpose. But take us into the mindset of what you think is going on there in the IFR.
Yeah, the IFR comment is I follow roads. And you're seeing the convoys on the roads and the tanks on the road. They're not going to the fields out there. And what it's showing to me is, despite the modernization programs that the Russians had, they really didn't modernize their military at the leadership level. And you're seeing some real tactical problems. Strategically, I think it's very flawed what they're doing. There's a term in the military, weight your main effort. And what I mean by weight your main effort is put the forces that you need in a critical place to go attack it. The capital city, take Kyiv, decapitate, eliminate the government. That's what it means. It's sort of like in football, that you put another offensive lineman on the one side of the center to weight the main effort, because that's where you're going to attack the defense. He didn't do that. He balanced his entire attack. It's very clear to me that he did that, and he didn't weight the attack on Kyiv, and now he's paying a tremendous price for it. And you're seeing a lack of strategic initiative by the Russians, and the Russians are in fact losing this fight. And the other one is, it goes back, it's amazing how many, you can go back to historic axioms, and it's going back to Napoleon. Napoleon made the comment, the moral to the physical is 3 to 1. And what he meant by that is that the moral being the elan of a nation, the willingness to fight of a nation, is much more important than the equipment you throw at it. It's proving that. The fighting spirit of the Ukrainians, and you're looking at a truly Churchillian figure in Zelensky, has rallied the nation, and they've got a real problem. That's the reason I make the comment that if I was today, and I'm not saying this is going to happen next week, but right now Russia's losing this fight, and I'm very concerned, because what are the next steps going to be? Is he going to use biological weapons? Is he going to use some type of nuclear weapons? Is it going to be, what you're going to see, my prediction is going to be in the next few weeks, is you're going to see trying him to level the city of Kyiv, a 2,000-year-old city, a capital in Europe, and you're going to see horrific casualties. There's 2 million people still living there, and you're going to see something really horrific. So I don't give any credit to the Russian military. I frankly, the other day, and they fired back at me because it was pretty funny. I actually insulted the Vermont National Guard when I made a comment that, this is like Vermont with nuclear weapons, and the Vermont National Guard replied to me, said, yeah, they gave me a yellow card, and I laughed and said, yeah, they're right, they should have. But this is just a terrible way to fight wars. They are not
It's a
doing
pretty
well.
good analogy there.
Yeah,
that's good. I like that. I'm sure they weren't.
they
weren't too happy about that. Let's shift here a little bit and let's start talking about the rest of the world as they are looking at this conflict, and specifically China. We know that Russia and China have formed some type of partnership here recently. It's probably gone back for years and years, but they've been, I think, more public about it recently. Fred, what does that mean for the United States? What does that mean as we look at trying to contain a very aggressive China on a number of fronts? Is it come back to that leadership question that we talked about earlier? Kind of help us put that in perspective for everyone.
Well, at the outset, I think this is an issue that the Biden administration also is unaware of. The President Trump, the Trump administration understood China is the main threat to our national security, not Russia. Russia is a declining power. It is a threat, but China is a much more aggressive and serious threat. This relationship between Russia and China is growing, and this conflict seems to be driving it closer. And there was this statement at the Olympics that they're going to have an everlasting partnership, and I think that's very troubling. But we need to look at this carefully and what's going on right now. The Chinese did not vote for a resolution condemning the Russian invasion, but they didn't vote against it in the General Assembly. They abstained, saying they didn't have enough time to review the resolution. And they are trying to blame NATO and the United States for this conflict, but they're also calling for negotiations. My guess is that they are very nervous about this invasion. This is hurting their economy. They're worried about sanctions hitting Chinese firms. They can't buy all the energy that the Russians were going to sell to the United States and Europe. They can buy some of it, but the capacity isn't there. The natural gas can't all be sent to China. So my guess is the Chinese are getting nervous, and my hope is that we will put the pressure much higher on China so they don't give the Russians an out, such as allowing Russian citizens to use Chinese credit cards to replace Visa and MasterCard. That supposedly is going on. Well, that Chinese credit card company, it should be sanctioned too for trying to get around Western sanctions. Long term, it's a very bad development that these two nations are working together, but there may be a ray of hope that the Chinese see this invasion as reckless and sloppy and unnecessarily upsetting their relationships with nations who the Chinese want to have a good relationship with. The Chinese, for example, had invested a great deal of money as part of their Belt and Road Initiative into Ukraine. Other Belt and Road Initiative nations are going to be looking at this and are going to be wondering, are the Chinese with us or not? Now, this is a terrible initiative for China to buy power and to control nations worldwide and promote their influence. But there are other aspects of this. I'm hoping they'll work to the advantage of our interests.
Well, you brought up a great point, General. I'm going to shift to you. We talk about China, we talk about the Chinese threat on a variety of different fronts. Fred just talked about sanctions on Russia. And of course, as an administration, my view is they probably didn't do that quick enough, right? When you see 200,000 tanks and troops amassing along that border, you kind of know what's coming, and they waited for the action to happen before the sanctions. Should we be looking at sanctions when we look at China? I mean, is it too early to go down that road? And it may be, but again, I'm trying to think about how do we get ahead of this issue if we see China being that partner to Russia, right? We've seen a number of U.S. companies here recently that have sort of decoupled themselves from Russia in a variety of different ways. Should those same companies be decoupling themselves from China for a variety of different reasons?
Yeah, I think there has to be a realization that China is an emerging power. They're basically somebody we have to look at as an adversary, both diplomatically and militarily, economically. And if we don't do that early on, we're catching up again. And we should start realizing that now, that this is not a friendly nation to the United States. It's not friendly in the entire region. And they're going to be a future power. We seem to, as Americans, we always seem to sit back and look maybe at the best in people instead of saying, these people are going to hurt us long-term economically or whatever it is, and militarily. And they're a growing threat, and we should recognize they're a growing threat. And we should very well pick our path to how we blunt that path of theirs going forward. Trump did that. Trump was very clear-eyed about it. It took, frankly, till he really got incensed about it was when when the COVID hit, that came out of that. I am one of those that actually believes it was an inadvertent release from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But we just have to be aware of that, and we're not. We're just slowed on the uptake.
So we've talked about China, we've talked about Russia, let's talk about Iran, because they are in this, it seems like the three of them have this pact that continues to move forward. We also have the Biden administration somehow negotiating a second, or maybe it's the same Iran deal. Fred, I know you have followed this closely, but I think it's baffling, not only to myself, but probably to a large majority of Americans, that probably one of the biggest mistakes in foreign policy, which was the Iran deal under President Obama, reversed by the Trump administration and President Trump, rightly so. We're trying to get back into that deal, that somehow this is going to save us. And probably the worst thing yet is we're letting the Russians negotiate it for us. It seems like this is an alternative universe that we're in. I know you followed this closely, but your thoughts on this one?
Well, President Trump rightly called the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran the worst deal ever, and it was. And we know from documents the Israelis stole from the Iranians in 2018. There was massive Iranian cheating. The deal had very weak verification, and it was a short-term deal, and it was the right decision to get out of it. But the Democrats have never forgiven President Trump for that. Biden was absolutely determined to get back in the deal. The problem is the Iranians refused to meet directly with American representatives at talks in Vienna over the last year. So we were at a different hotel from the rest of the delegations, and we let the Russians take the lead in negotiating an agreement. We now find out the Chinese were working very closely with them, because the Russian ambassador recently gave a statement bragging about what a great deal he worked out for the Chinese. And you just wouldn't believe this deal, Chad. Yeah. When the Iranians enrich uranium, which they shouldn't be enriching, they're only enriching to practice how to make nuclear weapons fuel. There's no need to enrich uranium. That enriched uranium will be given to Russia. And if a future Republican president pulls out of this deal, the Russians will give this uranium back to Iran. It's a way to punish a future Republican president who backs out of this terrible agreement.
Or any president, right?
Well,
any president.
Well, any president who backs out of this terrible agreement being negotiated by the Biden administration. But what's really strange right now is that the Russians have said that they want to carve out from sanctions related to Ukraine to exempt their trade with Iran, or they're not going to back the agreement. And what makes this even worse, this trade will be nuclear and missile related. That's what the Russians are selling to the Iranians. So now the Russians have a veto over this terrible agreement. I might add, the Iranians in the end, they may not even agree to this, because whenever they seem to be close to an agreement, the Iranians ask for more concessions, and we can't meet them. We keep negotiating downward on where we're going to stand. But it is simply a sign of the incredible foreign policy incompetence of the Biden administration. And so I don't know where this is going to come out, but it's not going to be good.
Well, you know, it's a dangerous world out there. We've got a lot of, adversaries, and what I think we're describing here is we need some leadership, and we're not seeing that out of the Biden administration. So let me shift again. Many Americans go about their day, trying to buy extremely high gas right now, put food on their table, go to work, and sometimes seeing foreign policy as something taking place overseas. I don't have to worry about it because it doesn't affect me on a daily basis, but I think we all know that it does. So if you're talking to an average American out there that doesn't really follow these issues like you do, how would you say it impacts them the most? Why should they care about it, even in the short term or maybe the long term? If you were sitting down with someone in middle of Texas or middle of Kansas or anywhere else, how would you say that, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, China, Iran, and a variety of other places, why should they care about it?
Elections matter. And when you cast your vote for president or for a senator or representative, you may be mad at a personality or something that someone did, or maybe social media or the media has convinced you that someone is a bad guy, but you have to look at the whole record. Your vote is very important. It's not just on gas prices or on some social issue. It's the security of our nation.
Yeah. If I can follow on that, I'd say I think of four names, and it's Pepper, it's Madison, it's Alex, and it's Luke. And those are my grandkids. And why this is important is because everything we're doing today will affect them. It's affecting their future, what they're going to grow up to be. And that's the reason why when during COVID, I said, we're the first generation that protected the old instead of the young. And we hurt them with all of the things that we were doing in the schools and the learning. You know, I remember when we were in the West Wing, a psychologist.
Say that again, because I think that's important.
Well, it's
We're the first generation
that protected the old instead of the young. And what I meant by that is we had a psychologist come in the East Room of the White House and said, and she looked at us and was talking about schools, and she said, look, you forget that all homes are not good homes. She said, when you send kids to school, 80% of the problems you find on child abuse are found in the schools. A lot of the kids, the best meals they get are during the day are what they get in the morning and what they get at noon in the schools. The interaction with other children, what they learn. And so I look at it and said, you know, if we don't get this right, the people we are hurting are the young. And that's, you know, and I think that's very important for us to remember, that we have to take care of, you know, that generation that's rising, the young ones that are out there. And sometimes we forget that and we focus in on ourselves instead of realizing we have an obligation to those that are growing up.
Yeah. And I think some of the real life impacts, right, is this inflation, right? I think we're up to over 7% inflation, maybe even a little higher. Astronomically high gas prices. So those are affecting real Americans every day. And I thought, you don't have to comment on this, but I thought it was extremely disingenuous to have the administration start saying that, you know, the high gas prices is because of what's occurring in Ukraine, sort of ignoring the past 11 and a half to 12 months of what they've been doing and not drilling, Keystone Pipeline, and it goes on and on and on. So let's shift one more time. We're going to talk a little bit about your time in the Trump administration. Now, both of you gentlemen were, you know, in the room with President Trump on a variety of different phone calls, meetings with foreign leaders. I'm not going to ask you what he said or did, but give us some perspective of, you know, what was the president's mindset when he would go into these meetings? You know, I think a lot of people have heard, well, maybe he didn't prepare very well for these meetings. Maybe he didn't kind of know, and he just kind of shot from the hip. I never really saw that. I saw someone who was relatively well-versed on the issues and knew where he wanted to take a meeting. But if you can give us a little bit of insight in there, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, and by the way, thanks for plugging the book earlier, War by Other Means, because that was what I was trying to do when I wrote the book, was to disabuse a lot of people of what actually happened inside the White House, because there was a public persona and there's a private persona, a professional persona of President Trump at the time. And there was just a couple of good examples of that. One of the very first times we were in the Situation Room, and we walked into the room and we were talking a pretty significant issue. It was actually Afghanistan. And he sat down and he was well versed on the issues, but you would think, okay, he's going to shoot from the hip or not talk. And he actually let everybody in the room talk. Yeah. And he went around and it was very Socratic. And if you had a position that was a little bit different than his, he would always press you and said, okay, let's find out where you really felt. Right. And he went around that room that first time, and there was a young lady sitting 2 chairs to my left. And he got to her and he said, what do you think? And she goes, Mr. President, I'm just a note taker in this room. And he goes, no, you're in the room. You've got an opinion. And I want to hear it. And people didn't realize he was very Socratic in the way he went about decision making, that if you were in the Oval Office or you were in the Situation Room, he would go around and talk. But he had his positions, and you had to be prepared to defend your position. Yeah. And if you didn't, you always ran into the problems with him. The second was the way he was as a person. And I remember during the height of the COVID issues we were having, we're just sitting in the Oval Office, like sometimes, and you've been in there, Chad, where sometimes, and so have you, Fred, where you kind of get into the just talk mode. Yeah. Just sit around and talk. And he was sitting there looking, and finally he said, in a very low voice, in a calm voice, he said, you know, I just want Americans to get better. And I said to him, stop. Go out there right now and say that to the American people. Just what you said, just the way you said it. And he wouldn't do it. Yeah. Because there was a public persona and a private persona. And I said, I want people to know that there was a different type of person. And he really cared for Americans. And that's the reason it was America First with him, and the American citizens are out there. I would tell people, he said, well, he's a Manhattan billionaire. He came from Queens. And if anybody knows anything about New York, Queens is middle class. Yeah. That's where he grew up. And he appreciated that. So I saw him as a different person out there, and I spent, you know, as I like to say, I spent 1,461 days in the White House which when you added up all the national security advisors that were there was 31 days longer than any of them combined.
But who's counting?
Right. But who's counting? But that's kind of my take on the White House.
Well, look, I experienced something very similar. I don't think I've ever, been in a room that you would see a man that was more patriotic, that loved the country more, and just genuinely cared about what was best for Americans every single day. So, it didn't matter really what the issue was. I was in there mostly on homeland security issues, but sat in on a couple of those meetings where it kind of meanders a little bit, and you start talking about other meetings, and whether it was financial or fiscal policy or whatever it might be, it was always coming back, how do I get the best deal for Americans? And but General, what you said is just kind of, and we saw this a number of different ways, right? Going around the room, having an open conversation, whether it was a cabinet meeting or some other meeting. You don't see that today. You don't see that from this president or this administration. Everything he does is very scripted. It takes very few questions from reporters because that's off script. And again, that goes back to the leadership issue. It goes about being in command of the facts and the issues, and I think we're not seeing it. Fred, let me ask you though. You spent some time in the White House. Give us maybe your favorite memory of an interaction with the president on a particular issues to give again, some insight into the White House.
Well, I had some very interesting discussions with the president about the size of government, the U.S. intelligence community. I talked with him at Mar-a-Lago and in the Oval Office about this. And, it's great to have someone who really is an outsider, who's not part of the system. Because when you talk about the size of these bureaucracies, how they operate, why they won't do what they're doing, the ordinary American says, well, why? Why do we have 17 intelligence agents? He asked me that. I said, well, sir, we shouldn't. And I told him about this enormous Office of Director Intelligence bureaucracy in Tyson's Corner of Virginia, which I remember I went there one day. I'm thinking, what do all these people do? He wanted to know too. And this incredulousness that, why do we operate this way? How can we fix this? I liked having a president ask that. And I mean, that's one of the many reasons I was so disappointed that Mr. Trump wasn't reelected, because he'll admit to anyone that personnel was something he wished he did better at, that he brought some people and he wished he hadn't at the beginning of the administration. But he really was fixing that in his final year. He had big plans for the second term to do better on personnel, to really clean up these bureaucracies. And I think there would have been significant house cleaning of some of these organizations, especially the intelligence agencies, if he had been reelected. And that is a goal for a future president that I'm very determined to.
Yeah, because it's important, right? Because it's not, administration is not only about the policies that you're implementing, but it's also about the people who are operationalizing those policies and are going to work every single day. It's one thing for the White House or even the president to say we're going to do X. Well, that's great, but then it's up to a variety of different officials at intelligence agencies or other departments and agencies to actually fulfill that. And when you don't have folks believing in that same vision, it becomes problematic. And you're right, I think we did see that. Let me end on a couple of questions for both of you. So if you got a phone call today, I doubt you're going to get it, but we'll see. A hypothetical world here. You got a phone call today, you had an audience with the president, and he said, look, I'm underwater on a variety of different issues, but I'm really underwater on what's going on overseas. What's the one piece of advice? The one piece of advice, if you were sitting across the table from the president or his national security team, that you would give them today? You may have 10 pieces, but let's just start with one.
Are we talking as Trump as president?
No, with Biden. So if you're sitting across the table with President Biden and his national security team today, what's the one thing, I know I'm putting you on the spot, what's the one thing that you would tell them they have to do?
I know, which I've said this over, fire your national security team. Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, these people do not have the experience and gravitas to deal with leaders like Putin and President
So that's important. This isn't a personal thing. You're talking about the experience, the life experiences, to make the decisions.
I'm talking about men and women with gravitas, and they don't have to be Republicans. There's Democrats. Leon Panetta would be light years ahead as Secretary of State or National Security Advisor. I think General Kellogg would be better. I don't know that they'll choose General Kellogg, but he would be my first choice. But realistically, we're in trouble right now. And we have a weak and incompetent president who's surrounded by weak and incompetent advisors. There must be Democrats who have some sense, who could be brought in and tell this president no when he wants to do something that doesn't make any sense. I think that's crucial for our national security.
Yeah.
You know, let me balance it two ways. One is I used to tell President Trump, when he would sit there, I said, Mr. President, trust your instincts, because they're whip good.
Yeah.
And I said, you're always good when you trust those. This administration, and this goes back to when I had a discussion with a Fox reporter years ago, not years, actually, I'm sorry, months ago, when I said I'm very concerned because I don't see anything that it could fix this problem that we currently have.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be different if you could say, as Fred said, fix it with your advisors. But that means your chief executive has to be willing to accept those advice and accept the advice. And right now, I think, and I made this comment, Fred and I were talking in the outer room, that for the next 3 years we've got this. My concern is that this is somebody who will not trust his advisors, has his own way of doing business, has never been in the commercial world, has been, as Bob Gates, the former Secretary of Defense.
Oh, this is a great quote. Go ahead.
Former Secretary of Defense and Director of the CIA, said that, and everybody respects Bob Gates.
Right.
Joe Biden has been wrong on nearly every national security question in the last 40 years. When you've got somebody like that saying that, which is followed by the President Obama saying about his vice president, never underestimate Joe's ability to screw something up.
Yeah.
I have great concern about the next 3 years because I don't have a good answer for that one, because I think we're stuck with something that is quite frightening to me. And if you don't believe me, look what's happened to our borders, what's happened to Afghanistan, what's currently happening with Ukraine. And I think this is just the start of many to come.
I'd like to add, Gates wrote that 10 years ago.
Yeah. 10 years.
Yeah.
So let me end on this one. I think we've talked a lot about challenges, some crises that the administration and America is facing. Let's try to end it on a little bit more of a hopeful note, if that's possible. Obviously, you know, you're both at the America First Policy Institute, so you're talking about, you're writing about America First policies as it relates to all of the issues that we talked about and more. Let's end on this. Talk a little bit about some of the work that you're doing there, and then maybe sort of what is that bright light that you see, around the corner for the country, for everyday Americans who are watching some of this and saying, you know, I'm really down because I don't see that light around the corner.
Yeah, I think what we're doing is we're putting together a program when we talk about the America First Policy Institute and America First that goes to a national security policy that ensures that this nation survives for years to come. Paul Kennedy, who's a Yale professor, wrote an incredibly good book about the rise and fall of the great powers going back to 1500. And he said nations fail because of strategic overreach. You start doing things that you're doing things overseas and instead of taking care of business at home, fixing your roads and your airports instead of fixing somebody else's roads and airports out there. And I think when we look at what we're doing in America First Policy Institute when it comes to national security, we're kind of focusing in on that, of making sure that we don't have a strategic overreach. We take care of our own people. But at the same time, we go back to what Teddy Roosevelt said, you know, speak softly and carry a big stick. And we're willing to use force if necessary. We proved that during the Trump administration. We weren't shy, as the hockey term is used, we weren't shy about dropping gloves and fighting when we had to. But it had to be measured, and we had to do it in the right place at the right time. And I think we're trying to build this policy and say the policies that we had in national security were really good, and we want those policies to continue instead of just being scattershot, instead of going out there and getting ourselves in adventures that cause us enormous problems. I don't care if it's the involvement in getting into Syria or another Iraq war or war in the Middle East that we don't have to be, and get ahead of the game. And we're being very, very proactive about it. And I think we're writing policy papers that we have positions that we're doing, and hopefully we're talking to a lot of outreach to Congress, talking to congressional members as well, trying to bring everybody into the right lane, make sure we're all heading in the same direction. You know, I'll just close with this. I said my daughter was a rower. She was in crew, and there was a thing they called a crab. And the crab was if you have a rower go out of sequence in rowing, it stops the boat. It's called a crab. And we're just making sure that conservatives going forward, we don't have any crabs on the boat. We want to make sure that we get everything pointed in the right direction.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right, Fred, take us home.
Well, I was attracted to America First because of my experience in government. I've worked at state and the CIA, the House Intelligence Committee, and I've always been frustrated by the foreign policy establishment that's consistently been anti-American, anti-Israel, pushing issues that are and solutions that are just not in the interest of the American people. Then Donald Trump came along with the America First initiative that puts the American people, our nation, our national security first. It's not isolationism. It's keeping the interests of our nation first.
Well, that's a great point. You know, the Jimmy Carter presidency brought us Ronald Reagan, right? So I think there is some light around the corner. Gentlemen, thank you. I appreciate your time. Another great episode of the America First Agenda. We are on every other week. You can find us at agenda.americafirstpolicy.com. And thank you for your time.
Good to be here.
Thanks, Chad.
Thanks.